Well, as people filter in, we'll get started. Thank you all for coming. My name is Ethan Brown. I'm the training program coordinator at Metcalf Institute, and we're really excited to team up with Solutions Journalism Network to put together this session with Jaime Palter and David Ho on marine carbon dioxide removal. It's a really interesting and important topic, and we're glad they can share their research and their expertise with us and give you all the opportunity to ask any questions you have. Just to quickly run down how the session will go, the two of them will present for 20 minutes or so, sharing a little bit of their research and a lot about the field more broadly. Um, and then we'll really spend the rest of the time with conversation and Q&A. I have some questions to get the ball rolling, but I encourage you all, if you have questions while they're presenting, send them in the chat. I'll keep tabs on it. And then after we get to past the presentation, please feel free to come off camera if you're not already and ask any questions you have. It's always better to see people's faces and hear your voices. So if you're able, that would be great. Before we jump in, I'd like to give the opportunity to Farah and Angela to talk a little bit about Metcalf and SJN. Farah, do you want to speak for a moment?
Sure. Thanks so much, Ethan. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm the executive director of the Metcalf Institute, and it's just my great pleasure to be able to bring together Metcalf and SJN to bring these types of trainings to this audience, and particularly to have Jaime Palter and David Ho here today to speak about a really important scientific topic, and one that Jaime and I have talked quite a bit about. It's a solution, but how can we cover it? How can we do a better job of making sure that we are true to the science, but also making that communication accessible to our news audiences? So thanks very much, Ethan. I'll turn it over to Angela.
Hi all, welcome. I'm glad to have you all here. I'm Angela with the Solutions Journalism Network. I am the Director of Communities of Practice, which incorporates all of our climate programming. And yeah, I agree with Farah. It's a great partnership with Metcalf. As we cover solutions in the climate space, there are a lot of ideas and options floating out there, and we're really interested in resourcing our journalists well to cover those all of the different aspects of those solutions with hope, but also with scrutiny and understanding of the science and the technology, and using solutions journalism to further accountability reporting in the climate solution space. So really happy to hear from Jaime and David today.
And with that, Jaime, David, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Should we go to the next slide, Jaime? So I'll get started. So both Jaime and I have written these pieces that are, for the mass audience. So here's an example of a piece that Jaime wrote for Scientific American, which is a bit more technical, but we make the same point in what we've written. So my piece was quite short, and the question is, how should we see these climate solutions? And we make the point that number one, we have to focus on eliminating our CO2 emissions from burning of fossil fuels. And then after that, we also have to focus on the carbon dioxide removal research, as if we still want to keep global warming below these targets that we set in Paris. And you'll see why in the upcoming slides. So, okay, one very handy thing about the climate system, and this is a plot from the last IPCC report from the Summary for Policymakers. But what's plotted here, so on the bottom axis is the amount of CO2 we put into the atmosphere. And on the left side is the amount of global warming we've had, right? So the sort of wiggly line, black line, is how much warming we've had. And then after that are the different scenarios, the different IPCC scenarios. So those are the projections. But what you see here is basically a linear relationship, right? The more carbon we put into the atmosphere, the warmer it gets. So, you know, this is not good news, but it's also very handy news because we know that in order to stop the warming, we have to stop putting carbon into the atmosphere, right? So next. So the bad news here is that, so we set this target of 2 degrees warming by the end of the century in Paris with the preference for 1.5. And in order to reach 1.5, we're supposed to be at 20 billion tons of CO2 emissions by the year 2030. So in 5 years, right, we're supposed to be at 20 billion tons. We're now at a little over 40 if you include land use change and fossil fuel burning. And so what you see here, the red point, this is where we're at. And each of those bars, the green and the red bars, are how much CO2 emissions decreased during COVID when the world basically shut down. So if we decrease CO2 emissions as much as we did during COVID in each of the next 5 years, we're still going to miss the target, right? So we're way off target right now. So this means that, you know, we need to do something.
Okay, so I'm gonna get the baton now and talk about why, even though emissions reductions has to be our first and foremost action that we're taking now, the research on carbon removal is still essential. Because even if we have amazing success in reducing emissions, as this plot tries to show, we still need carbon removal to limit the harms of warming, where every 1/10 of a degree matters. So if we follow this emissions reductions pathway below 2 degrees Celsius in red, we have in orange the warming from other greenhouse gases that are the non-carbon dioxide greenhouse gases. Some of these are tied to agriculture needed to feed people, like that produces nitrous oxide. And so we need CDR to offset that. Then some CO2 emissions are just going to be very hard to abate, and hopefully we'll get there someday, but we may have persistent emissions well into the end of the century. So to remove the hardest to abate CO2 emissions in the light orange, we need CDR. And then, as David showed us those sobering graphs, we're in all likelihood going to overshoot what we think of as a comfortable warming level. And a safe warming level. And so if we want to dial the climate back, the only way to do that is to then remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and that's shown in green. So for those 3 reasons, we still need CDR, and we need the research to figure out if it's feasible. And so that's the second message, is that we have to fully fund CDR research. And since David and I both are oceanographers that got our start doing fundamental ocean research on circulation and the carbon cycle, that's where we have been spending our time, is in understanding how MCDR might work. And so I think it's important to understand where we are at in terms of emissions reductions. We're kind of missing those goals and need to speed it up quite a bit. But in terms of developing CDR and MCDR solutions, it's good to situate where we are now. And even by a generous accounting of novel CDR that's being delivered today, that's all CDR that is not tied to planting trees. We're about a factor of 10,000 behind where we'd need to be to achieve the goals of CDR by 2050, those orange and green goals. But basically any pathway that keeps us on this kind of below that 2 degree limit demands somewhere in the range of 5 to 10 billion tons of CO2 removal. And at present, the sum of all novel CDR is only about 1 million. And I think that's a generous accounting, 10 to the 6th. So this is that factor of 10,000 that we are short in achieving that. So the scale of that is hard for people to imagine. So David came up with a brilliant analogy, and I'll pass it to him to explain what that is.
Yeah, so maybe some of you used to follow me on Twitter when we were still on there. But I thought that, the way we talk about these things that are orders of magnitude difference, like thousands or millions or billions, like politicians are always talking about millionaires and billionaires as if they're the same things, but they're completely not, right? The difference between a million and a billion is a billion. So, I thought that in order for people to understand the scales of what we're talking about, it might be good to talk about carbon dioxide removal like a time machine that takes you back to an atmosphere you had in the past, right? So to give some examples, let's go to the next slide. So here are some stories, for those of you who are journalists. Some of these come from news stories that have been written about carbon dioxide removal. And so the first one is about this direct air capture plant in Iceland that had a goal of removing 4,000 tons of CO2 every year. And then there are these press releases, one from H&M and one from Salesforce, that one where they're buying 10,000 tons of CO2 removal, and the other where they're going to plant 100 million trees. And then finally is this story about how during the Biden administration, the US was investing in these direct air capture hubs. They were putting in, I think, a total of $3.5 billion for 4 of these things, each of them with a goal of removing 1 million tons of CO2. And I'll just say that H&M and Salesforce, I mean, these are huge companies, right? Salesforce had a revenue last year of $35 billion. And then H&M is 20. And so these companies make a lot of money. And so if you look at this, 4,000 tons of CO2, that's 3 seconds of removal in a whole year, right? So that takes you back by 3 seconds. 10,000 tons, that's a little better, but that's 8 seconds. 1 million tons, okay, so it's 13 minutes. And then finally, planting 100 million trees by 2030, that will take us back by 33 minutes, right? About half an hour, much less than this webinar will last. So right now, the scale of the problem is so much bigger than the solutions that we have for it. Okay, so next. So then people are interested in how we're going to scale these carbon dioxide removal techniques that we have. And one natural place to look is the ocean because of 2 major things. One is that the ocean already removes a lot of CO2, like a quarter of what we put into the atmosphere goes into the ocean. Okay. And the other is that of the active reservoirs of carbon on Earth, the ocean is the largest by far, right? The biggest is rocks, but basically we don't get the carbon out of the rocks. And then there's another reason, next slide, which is that the ocean is a big contactor that, if you look at this view of the ocean, which a lot of people don't look at because we tend to focus on the land, but in the middle of that is Hawaii. So we actually look at that a lot. And you see that the ocean is huge, right? It covers over 70% of the Earth's surface. So there's a lot of surface to exchange with the atmosphere. And actually, this is an area of research that I focused on for my career, and my entry into this space is looking at the transfer of gases between the atmosphere and the ocean. And it's important to note that marine carbon dioxide removal is really a 2-step process. There are various methods that people have proposed, but all of them essentially seek to reduce the amount of CO2 in the surface ocean. But this is not yet CDR, right? CDR happens when this ocean state equilibrates with the atmosphere, right? When atmospheric CO2 then goes into the ocean. Next.
Okay, thanks for that. So among all of the strategies that MCDR presents, because there are various pathways to try to do that 2-step process, I like to divide them, a lot of us like to divide them into 2 categories: the biological or biotic methods, shown here in these 4 Minecraft style schematics that accompany that Scientific American paper. So you can read more about them there. But these include things like iron fertilization, where iron is spread on the surface ocean. And the idea is that the marine phytoplankton, these single-celled algae, will bloom. They'll photosynthesize, like the same chemical equation as shown here as happens in trees. And then that will pull CO2 out of the atmosphere and produce oxygen, or no, sorry, pull CO2 out of the water into their cells and produce oxygen. Those cells would then ideally sink into the deep ocean. The surface ocean, then depleted in CO2, would re-equilibrate with the atmosphere, thereby drawing down CO2 from the atmosphere. And that's the idea behind any of the biological methods. Use the biology to change the chemistry of the surface ocean. Once the chemistry of the surface ocean has changed, that is, reduce the CO2 comes in from the atmosphere. Other types of this are macroalgae cultivation, where you grow kelp or something like that. And then importantly, if you just grow the kelp and allow it to decompose at the surface ocean, you've really done nothing for the climate. But if it were to grow and then sink, taking its carbon, locking away that carbon with it into the deep ocean, then maybe something would happen. Some people have proposed artificial upwelling, where the nutrients of the deep ocean are brought artificially to the surface to sustain more marine life, and then you hope that that sinks and does the same thing, you know, as any of these methods. And then blue carbon restoration is a bit different. This is one where you restore the health of a salt marsh or mangrove and try to capture carbon in the sediments and biomass of those systems. So this is what we kind of group as the biological methods. And then there are the abiotic methods. These are a little bit more, in some ways, straightforward, because you aren't using biology to manipulate chemistry, you're going after the chemistry itself. So in the case of ocean alkalinity enhancement, terrible name, but for what I think is a possibly promising technique, you find a way to increase the alkalinity of the surface ocean. What does that mean? It means that you raise the pH a little bit. In doing so, the carbon that's stored at the surface ocean as CO2 is shifted into a different type of carbon that's more permanently stored in the ocean. Once it's shifted away from CO2, more CO2 can enter the surface ocean. And this is how the climate modulates itself naturally on the timescale of millions of years. And so this technique really seeks to accelerate what will naturally happen over hundreds of thousands to millions of years and try to make it happen much, much faster, so that it has on like human relevant timescales. And the last one that I'll talk about is in the abiotic methods is direct ocean removal, where pumps can bring seawater into a facility that extracts the CO2 and then stores the CO2. That then the CO2 deficient water is sent back to the ocean, and you hope that it takes up more CO2. And there are various flavors of that. Okay, so this is the end of our prepared remarks. We land on like the work that we're currently, David and I are both most deeply involved in the research behind ocean alkalinity enhancement. I would say by our own assessment, it has possibly the best risk to reward ratio, because there are ways of doing it that are almost, that have never been seen to be harmful to ecosystems or species. You could do it in it kind of depends on how you create the alkalinity, but the idea would be to do it with no perturbation to ecosystems. And it has a lot of, at the geophysical level, the ocean has a lot of room to store carbon if the alkalinity were shifted. And so just coming back to the whole theme that we started with, David and I both do this research trying to evaluate the potential of this strategy with all the details of rigorous science, with hopes that it would someday matter, that it will someday matter. And that hope really hinges on whether society can slow emissions to a tiny fraction of where they are today, so that we're closing the spigot to those emissions And these kinds of techniques, we hope, will open the drain enough to remove what's left of them. And I think we've successfully kept our prepared remarks below 20 minutes, and so that we can have a more freewheeling conversation.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Jamie and David. And a reminder to folks who, sorry, did you say something?
Oh, sorry. I can stop sharing now.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, a reminder to folks who entered as we were getting started. We're up to 44 people now, which is great. If folks want to raise their hands throughout this and come off camera to ask questions, that would be great. You can send questions in the chat if you're unable to. I'll get us started with a few questions, though, as people think about what they'd like to ask. Um, I think when a climate solution has too many flaws or limitations, I see people very easily kind of throw their hands up or frame writing in the context of it doesn't work, it's a scam, it's a distraction. And I've seen that happen before with carbon removal. And I'm curious, what advice would you have to journalists to avoid overreacting or underreacting to a solution's limitations?
Jamie, do you want to take that?
That's a tough question. I'm as a scientist and not a journalist, I can kind of only say what keeps me from feeling that way, which is that we really need these solutions. And so to get myself out of bed in the morning, I have to like approach it with the mindset that this could work, and we need to chase it down to the ends, to its logical ends, to see if it can work and if we can prove it. And I try to remain kind of agnostic. Like there is hypothesis testing, there's just testing, and there are some things that will be dead ends. They will fail. I approach the science, and I think journalists should, like, I really respect when they do the same, which is, if it is a scam, we do have to point it out. And there are plenty of scams out there. And so some of that journalism is just like excellent journalism. So I guess, I would guess the real challenge is figuring out where you are in that spectrum, of remote hope to full scam. David, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that's right. And the only thing I'll add is that science is also about failures, right? Like, if we had the choice, I mean, we would fail a lot more, if there was unlimited funding, because that's how you make progress. And it's the same way with these solutions.
Yeah. And I want to follow up on that real quick. And then, Michael, I'll get to your question. Because something we talk a lot about at Metcalf with journalists is the process through which scientists build knowledge, and how getting that wrong in journalism can lead to these narratives like the science changed or the science was wrong, and that's not really what's happening. Um, and with this field of research that is still growing and learning, like you said, David, you want to be open to trying things and failing. How can journalists best contextualize what the state of knowledge is right now and avoid some of those pitfalls as the knowledge grows and evolves?
Yeah, well, what I would like to see more is, um, these projects framed as more research than solutions, right? Because when they're framed as solutions, then either they work or they don't work. And as we know, they don't work now because emissions are so high. But if it's framed as research, then it's one step towards something. And research is all about making incremental progress until you have a solution.
Michael, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. I have some background reading catch up to do now that I see your articles, but can you say a bit briefly here about where in the ocean, um, I would start with coastal versus deep ocean, but I'll leave it to you to spread that more widely. Where in the ocean would alkalinity enhancement make the most sense? And part two, if you'll allow for it, is what gives you assurance? What's the evidence for uh, double negative here? What tells you that it is not necessarily a bioreactive thing? What tells you this is not going to spur the wrong kinds of phytoplankton blooms, dead zones, that sort of thing?
Can I
So,
take the second one first?
yeah. So before Jamie answers the question, could we just have you say who you are?
Oh, I am a longtime science writer and editor, used to be at Woods Hole Oceanographic, a lot of years at NASA, recently left NASA because times are what they are, but I've covered the ocean extensively over the years, at mostly within institutions and some on my own.
Thanks.
Thanks for that. Okay, so I want to do, I think the second one is kind of just a more straightforward answer than the first. So there have been a number of, and of course there should be many more, what we call mesocosm experiments, where they take tanks filled with seawater, sometimes with whole natural ecosystems, sometimes with specific species, and dose them with alkalinity of various forms, and then follow what happens. And very often the dose, they'll do 2 or 3 or 5, and they'll go up to a dose rate that's way more than what we expect in the ocean and hold it there for way longer than we'd expect it to be in the ocean, and check what happens to the ecosystems. And there are some times in those experiments that you do find harms or changes, at least, especially when they're using an alkaline source that's like a rock that has other constituents that can be harmful, like heavy metals. But for pure alkalinity, at dose rates that we'd expect to actually be operational, it's very hard to see any change at all in these mesocosm experiments and they'll study the DNA and the nutrients and the particles, and I mean, on and on. And in honesty, it's like going to be hard to sustain that research because the result is mostly boring when you use pure alkalinity sources and do it at dose rates that are like the background. So that's, I would say, the answer to that second question. And then David, do you have something about the first question about where in the ocean alkalinity enhancement?
Yeah, I tend to think that at least at the start, it will be done at the coast because that's where, infrastructure is, that's where people are, that's where your energy is. And yeah, if you're going to transport stuff offshore, that's going to cost you both in terms of, well, energy, carbon, and money. So we'll stick to the coast, I think, for now.
Thank you, Michael. If anyone else has questions, feel free to raise your hand or send in the chat. A question we did get in the chat is, by what year would we be able to reach 1.5 degree Celsius temperature if we were able to implement the process of carbon removal very soon? I think they rephrase later, but yeah.
I guess this is where how to balance hope with this.
Yeah.
And we have been at 1.5 for a year or two, and it's meant to be a decadal time where you assess whether you've reached right. Climate is kind of 10-year time scale. So in about 8 or 9 years, we'll know if we already reached 1.5, but we're pretty darn close. So if we could remove massive amounts, if we could stop emissions right away and remove massive amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere, we could achieve that 1.5, but it's, for practical purposes, the 1.5 target might be in the rearview mirror. And anything, once you get to 1.7, 1.8, there are very difficult pathways, but there are still pathways there that combine extraordinary emission reduction with extraordinary CDR.
Grace has a question.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Grace. I'm a reporter for EOS, which is the magazine of the American Geophysical Union. Thanks, David and Jamie, for being here. Hi, Jamie. I'm curious if you both could talk a little bit more about the biggest research questions that are yet to be answered when it comes to like the barriers to scaling up marine CDR, and in particular, what of those questions you are personally working on.
Yeah, so I think for both of us, well, let me just talk about the sort of different challenges first. So you have the technical challenges, you have the geophysical ones, you have the environmental ones, there are the societal ones, the governance ones, and the financial ones, right? And some of those are related, and each of those is quite big. So we, being oceanographers, we're focused on the geophysical ones because that's what we know best. And I think that, basically all those methods, you have to answer all of them to get to the answer of how much CDR, how much MCDR is actually possible. And I think that is the biggest question is, given all the different constraints, it's not just a technical problem, it's also how are you going to fund it, what laws permit things to be done and what will people accept and how much harm might you do and so on. But I think ultimately we need to know how much can we remove from the atmosphere. Even though the models, the integrated assessment models say we need 10 billion tons of removal every year. Maybe we can only do 10 billion tons. Maybe we can only do 500 million tons a year, right? And it's important to know whether that's the case or not.
Yeah, I would add something to that. I totally agree. Oceanographers. So I designed a whole project that David and I work on together that avoided the permitting and and some of the social problems by like using an analog for ocean alkalinity enhancement that didn't require me putting anything in the ocean, and just trying to do it through this kind of, I won't go into the details, but without dumping anything, using this analogy for ocean alkalinity, analog for ocean alkalinity enhancement. But on the geophysical side, I would add one more thing, which is not just how much we can add to the ocean, but how much we can be sure it happened. Because there's a real observational challenge that you can add alkalinity to the ocean, which can draw CO2 out of the atmosphere in a model of the ocean, like a numerical model. But the observational requirements to be sure it happened in nature are very, very, very challenging because there's a lot of carbon in the ocean already, and the ocean is a turbulent, dynamic environment with tons of background variability. So there's how much can we do, and can we prove that it was done? And I think those two questions for an oceanographer are they're like long, fascinating challenges to dig into.
Thank you.
We got a good question in the chat, which was following up on a comment earlier. If marine carbon dioxide projects are framed as research as opposed to solutions, do you think that the public and funding mechanisms will be as receptive to fund MCDR and take it as seriously and with urgency?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. It depends on, for me, it depends on the source of funding. And I do think that at some point, all of these climate solutions should be government funded and maybe even, government run. And, as we know, well, before this administration, the US government funded a lot of research that was just for research sake. It wasn't, to produce a specific product. So we definitely have the appetite to do research, right? And so I think that, if source of funding is from world governments, then it shouldn't be an issue to frame it as not an immediate solution, but maybe a future one. At least that's how I see it.
Yeah. I don't have anything to add to that one. That was nice.
Great. If anyone else has questions, feel free to raise hands or send. In the meantime, I can ask another one of mine. So one of the Solutions Journalism Network pillars of solutions journalism is evidence of whether a solution works or doesn't work. And we've been talking a lot at Metcalf about how journalists can think about evidence more critically when they're doing these stories. So I'm wondering if a journalist is doing a story on marine CDR, what insight might speaking to a scientist such as yourselves add to the story? And are there other types of sources that you'd encourage them to seek out for other perspectives on a project?
Yeah. Wait, so the question I'm trying to okay, so first, yes, I think other sources are really needed because for just like many climate solutions, like a lot of the barriers aren't purely technical. Even just getting the permits to get in the water is a major challenge and requires like often public comment periods, which then there's a whole level of expertise that, I don't have about how you engage the public, how we talk about it, why people have passions about it and that kind of thing. So I think if I understood that part of the question, yeah, I think beyond scientists for sure. And then what was the other piece?
Just wondering what angle you think that you as a scientist would bring to this type of story that is important.
Oh, evidence that it would work. Well, we would have a lot to say. I think when anyone calls to ask about that, we have a lot to say about any specifics of a project and love to get into it as much as a journalist will put up with us, I think.
Yeah, I know something we were talking about when we were on a training last month was how you can also go to a scientist that did not work on that particular thing and get their feedback because they may kind of have a better ability to talk about the situation from a bird's eye view. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think that's really important. There are, right, when you're very close to something and very invested in it, it's maybe hard to be objective. When your paycheck depends on it, like you're at a private company, it can be harder to be objective. And even if you are, the perception of your entanglements is in conflict of interest is very hard to overcome, I would guess, with an audience. So I try to say yes as often as I possibly can to journalists because I know a little bit and my paycheck doesn't depend on getting to a particular answer. So I hope that gives me some level of remove from having to report promise or of something that if I don't think it's promising.
Allie.
Hi, yeah, I didn't realize that this was for journalists. I am actually an investor in the space of marine carbon dioxide removal and previously directed the ocean sector, a membership organization of ultra-high net worth family offices. So I wrote a lot of research for family offices about various sectors in the blue economy. And the fact of the matter is it takes a long time to get really smart on this topic. And it takes a lot of research and talking to different people who have different perspectives to form a holistic point of view. It can be so easy to grab onto a tagline or a perspective and just run with it. But once you really dive deeper and speak to people smarter than you are, because there are people much smarter than I am still about this topic, you're able to kind of see the intricacies, not only in the biogeochemical region of the ocean, but like we were talking about, the community, social license, the permitting, the policy. There are so many things that go into it. So on one hand, I think it could be helpful to not only speak to scientists at like Woods Hole or Scripps or anywhere that there's being a lot of research done, or Hawaii as well, David. But I think organizations like Ocean Visions, Carbon to Sea, even just getting more and more perspectives, because it takes a lot to be able to diffuse it into a comprehensible narrative. And you might go in thinking you have one point of view about all MCDR techniques. It's a fascinating space, and you just really have to, forgive the pun, dive in to really immerse yourself in all of the different twists and turns that this could have. And it's exciting because there are potential solutions, and you really have to think about what the externalities could be within the ecosystem, but then thinking about, okay, what if we don't do anything? What's going to happen then? So I just encourage people to go deeper and not just take it at surface level. There were a lot of ocean puns in there. Sorry.
Thanks for the perspective, Ali. Did you have a question in there?
No, I just wanted to add in those thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Yuritsa has her hand up. No,
We lost her.
we lost her.
Pardon, I was speaking, I was on mute. Yeah, Torres, City of Dallas, Urban Ag, and our Office of Environmental Quality and Sustainability. Not a journalist, more in the data and research realm, but in local government. And not necessarily a question, but wanted to hone in what Ali was mentioning, and as well as what Jamie is mentioning. I think like the strength of like as journalists, what you could do with this data, because like as like a climate scientist, like you learn about more like this 1.5 Celsius item that we're trying to reach, but getting that to the whole picture to the public and understanding the science. They may not need to know, or not need to know, but understand the one-to-one, but how does this affect them economically, long term? Is it going like not just the environment itself, but like other adverse effects is really what I think in the journalism sector is like communicating the science, not just the numbers, but like to every day. So one item that Ali had mentioned as well, connecting with those like NGO partners who are working with scientists one-on-one on like, there are like, at least I'm more into like urban agriculture and the tree realm of things, but there's like Nature Conservancy or Texas Tree Alliance, I believe, or the public lands organizations that essentially create these reports, communicate the science, and they work with stakeholders, not only like local government business level, but in the private sector as well. And that connection of story is what I think a lot of folks are missing in the greater scheme of things.
Yeah, and I think that actually poses a question that I was wanting to ask you too. I know that you're working more on the science side, but it is interesting to think about the comparison of what different solutions cost. And I know oftentimes uh, actually transitioning to clean energy and some of the emissions cutting solutions can be less expensive than some of these carbon removal solutions. So I'm curious from uh, your perspective, I know working on the science side more so, is there kind of thought about weighing different solutions in terms of cost or how this could become not just feasible, but actually cost effective?
Well, I guess I mean, I don't understand completely how the world works. I don't understand what's happening in the US, but I imagine if we had a world king that decides what's going to be done, then we wouldn't be doing, any of these, working on any of these climate solutions, right? We would just decarbonize and everything would be electrified, everything would be good. But that's not how the world works. And what we see is that we're not decarbonizing fast enough. So then people start looking at these solutions, not just carbon dioxide removal, but also like solar radiation management, like things that seem very far-fetched at some point. It just, I think, signals how desperate we are, just because we see that the world isn't doing what it's supposed to do. So yes, even though it's cheaper to do it, but somebody is benefiting from that not being done, well, namely fossil fuel companies at this point. But because these things aren't being done, then we start to look at other solutions.
Yeah, I agree. I think of this as paying for trash removal or pollution cleanup. That's the only thing that CDR offers. Whereas some of the, and David has pointed this out to me, some of the solutions that reduce emissions also provide like an amazing service, like solar energy brings you energy and displaces emissions. So so when people have to be willing to pay to clean up pollution for this to, someone has to be willing to pay for it. And even if it becomes low cost, it will be hard to compete with some of the, at least the low hanging fruit on the emission side that also offer tremendous services.
Yeah. I appreciate folks sharing their kind of comments in the chat, and I would encourage if we can do comments there so that we can make sure that our questions are directed toward Jamie and David, and we can maximize their expertise here. I see Irene's hand is up if you have a question.
Yes, hi, Irene from Carbonacy Initiative. Thanks for the shout out, Allie. Thank you guys so much for a great presentation. You guys covered a lot of really complex material at the top. I thought it was awesome. My question is around what are some of the kind of pitfalls, watch outs, things that kind of make you go, oh, I really wish journalists wouldn't cover it that way as you guys are seeing this type of topic? What are some of the kind of unhelpful narratives you wish you would not have to read again? Thanks.
Well, I think the biggest one is to present it like we have the solution. Like when well, I saw a piece about something called enhanced rock weathering, which involves grinding up rocks and spreading it on fields. And it was called, magic dust. Like it's not, right? And it's not a current solution. So I wish that those kinds of things weren't done. Because we're so far from having a solution. It's all research right now.
Yeah, I'm so glad Angela said that. This has come up in previous Metcalf events, that often the article is just fine, and it's the headline writer that makes it like almost, it's like with this one simple trick, which is like totally insane. There's no one simple trick. There's emissions coming from every sector, every activity. Those all have to get slashed. Then on top of that, we have to do the research to see if these solutions will ever A, work, B, scale, C, can be proven, D, will have social acceptance, E, someone will pay for them, and on down the list. So just I think people can read complicated things and hold many thoughts in their head at once, especially the two thoughts that we need the research, but it's not ready yet. And those two things can live in the same universe and do. So yeah, usually a lot of times the article will be just fine. And it's the headline that gets you.
Yeah, we've had a few great questions in the chat. I'll do this one. By which year do you think that CDR may take place, given all the difficulties? And I think I would maybe add to that, at a small scale in a smaller project or trial versus actually thinking of it as a climate solution en masse.
Yeah. I would say right now at the research level, people are doing really good work and they're starting to amass evidence. I always go to this company in Halifax called Planetary. They are putting alkalinity into a very well observed basin in Halifax, and doing a good job measuring what we can measure now and modeling what we can't. And they might be removing, you know, on the order of 1,000 tons, 1 to 10,000 tons of CO2 from the atmosphere. And so and then there's research burgeoning like in various places. And I think David has a really good point, that you could regard that as research too, although to fund that research, they're selling the credits. And the removal has some certainty. So things are happening, but in terms of their climate relevance, that will, right? It's a scale separation where the emissions are right now at 40 billion tons. That's 40, then 9 more zeros. And the novel CDR is happening at most 1 million tons, the novel CDR. So it's just, until we have, basically we'd have to add as much novel CDR every month of the year. I did the math for this, every month of the year for 80 years, starting now, for it to get to where the climate models need it to be to keep warming within 2 degrees. Every month, we add as much as we already have ever done each year, for every month for 80 years. So the scale is huge. So things are happening now. 2 thoughts to hold on. Things are happening now. Some of them seem pretty successful in terms of just showing at a research level it might work. And the mountain to climb is very, very tall.
Another question from the chat. There's a certain degree of science literacy needed from both the author and the journalist and the audience. And do you have any preferred resources that you feel have done a good job communicating the science around marine carbon in a digestible way? Or if not, what would an ideal resource look like in your opinion?
Well, from a technical point of view, Jamie wrote this beautiful article in Scientific American, along with very nice illustrations. And I mean, I did write a short article about the scale of the challenge, that the time machine thing got turned into a 1-page thing about just the scale of our challenge. And I think that one is quite accessible. So it really depends on the point of view that you're after. But yeah.
Great. Then the final question we'll do, which I saw was asked. So I'm combining 2 questions here, but given the absence of government funding right now, or changing landscape, however you want to call it, how do we move this forward, and how do we kind of think about the way this research will be funded in a way that will keep it scientific and credible and all that?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, I think. You have some philanthropic funding, and maybe that's the next best thing, but it's not enough. And so then you're left with, what the philanthropies want to fund, right? As opposed to a broad range of things where you can afford some failures and so on. So, there's a world in which, look, if we don't do the right things, we're just screwed, right? I mean, this is not the hope part of things, but I think that we do what we can, but if there are cases where, if people in power make the choices to go a certain way, then there's nothing we can do about it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jamie and David. Really appreciate your insight and expertise on this topic. Before we sign off, Angela and Farah, if Angela, you can go first if you'd like to share what's coming up with SJN.
Yeah, sure. Thanks again, all. I've really appreciated this discussion. As journalists, we often talk about we don't need to be the experts on everything. We need to talk to the experts. And so we appreciate you, both of you experts, being here to describe what's going on in the space more deeply and helping us all with our science literacy. To that end, we have another webinar coming up in a couple weeks. More soon, please follow us and look on our website. I don't have a link ready yet, but it will be on covering myths and disinformation around climate solutions. So looking at promises and pledges, especially in more the corporate realm, but across the board. And we'll have some great panelists, Amy Westervelt from the Drilled podcast, Aaron Cantu from Capital and Maine, and third panelist yet to be confirmed. Kind of talking a little bit more about, how to look at the evidence and the limitations and assess when maybe something's not working, even if the promises are there. So thanks.
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
So thank you guys for hosting, and I want to thank the people that attended, and especially I want to call out Alec Lund, who's a amazing climate reporter who has this incredible story of almost dying in the wilderness in Norway recently, and he's online with us. So I'm very thankful that he's still with us and able to write amazing stories.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that.
You guys should look up his story if you don't know.
Thank you, David. And yes, we're really happy you're still here with us, Alec, and in this room right now. Thank you both, Jamie and David. I did want to just highlight two things from Metcalf Institute. So we will be doing another training with Solutions Journalism Network in December. That one is really focused on science literacy and science communication. So this is how scientists and artists are coming together to help visualize climate in different ways and through artistic means. That is a project by University of Rhode Island's professor and the Art League of Rhode Island. So that should be a really fun one. And then just in terms of understanding how to communicate science better, Metcalf will open its annual Science Immersion Workshop application in January, and that is a week-long, basically science camp for journalists. So we always welcome applications from anyone within the SJN network. So just follow us on social or you can sign up for our newsletter as well. But Angela and Ethan, thank you. Any last words, Ethan?
No, I don't think so. Thank you all so much, and we'll hope to see you at the next one.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thanks, bye.
Hasta la vista.